Hello. Welcome.
Hey, everybody.
Hi. Welcome to our very last book club. Wow. What a summer.
Wow,
what a
what a summer.
season. What a time.
So many good books.
So if you're joining us for the first time for the very last one, or if you've been watching all the way through, thank you. This is the Kate May Max Summer Book Club. The theme of this summer was the Lesser-Known Victorians. So we talked a bit about, we did novels, we did memoirs, we did comedy, we did social critique all over the summer, talking through books that we usually miss in education or otherwise.
Yeah.
So some gems, some lessers, some wins, some
And
losses.
I feel like this week you're cheating a little bit.
Yeah. This week I feel like I'm cheating a little bit with the picture of Dorian Gray. That's our discussion for this week. It's definitely not lesser known, but like I said last week, my excuse is like it's little read, perhaps lesser read. I feel like everybody knows this book, has seen maybe one or two adaptations,
knows the premise or something.
But very few people I talked to have actually read it. So that was we're finishing off with a big hitter.
Should we say the premise that most people already know, just like the basic?
First you should introduce yourself.
I thought I needed no introduction.
Yeah.
My name is Francis. I am a good friend of Evelyn's. And I actually joined for one other book club.
Yes, Francis was
early
with
this
us
summer
for our
from
second
Mrs.
book
Seacole.
club.
A strong recommendation.
Yeah.
The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole.
And so the fans just demanded
really
that you
great,
came back.
Short, fun book. A travelogue that actually like really brings you. It was one of the coolest like books into like late 19th century history. It was really cool.
Now you're back.
Now we're back for a book that I kind of asked me in this one because I really wanted to read this book. I never have.
And I'm Evelyn, the moderator. And thanks for joining us one last time. It's so special, so fun. Hi, Joanne. Hi, Aiden. And hi, whoever else is in watching this. There's a live chat feature. So if you're on your desktop and you're logged into your account, you should be able to access that. If you're on mobile, it's a little trickier. It's like sliding up from the bottom. But if you have any questions, comments, anything at all that you want to add during the course of the book club, feel free. We'll respond to them. My mom sent me a whole list of pre-asked questions that she wanted us to touch on a while ago. Okay. So we'll come back to those.
That sounds great.
Yeah. Okay, but so Picture of Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde, last book choice. Pretty short, was originally a novella and then was sort of fleshed out to be a full novel, which I think we'll talk about more. Yeah.
You can almost tell.
Yeah. But do you want to walk us through the premise a little bit? Oh,
sure. And sorry if there are any like literature people out there who, if I butcher this a little bit, but the basic premise is the thing that you might hear in like an English class is that there's this young man, Dorian Gray, and a beautiful painting is made of him when he's like 17 or 18, and
by this man who's obsessed with him.
By this artist who's obsessed with him, like loves him clearly, and Dorian Gray makes a wish that he's young and beautiful, and he's like, why do I have to grow old when this painting will stay young and beautiful? And then
be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
So his wish is granted through seemingly otherworldly forces. And as we go through the novel, Dorian Gray starts to experience life's pleasures, which seemed in this novel to go hand in hand with like horrible sin and vices. Yeah. And as he becomes this sort of corrupted version of himself, the portrait becomes hideous. So the portrait changes.
He does not age.
And he doesn't
age.
He
does not show the signs of his crimes or sins. The portrait does.
Yeah, and it's funny. It's like every other page, pretty much every scene he's in, there's a remark that's like, Dorian Gray was the sexiest man alive.
Yeah.
It's like, you've never seen anything better than this. This is the peak of humanity. Everyone who meets him is like, you're the most beautiful person I've ever seen. I'm obsessed with you. And he's just like, as it should be.
Yeah. So,
keep going.
Where should we
what
start?
Happens next?
Should I give some more overview? Okay, yeah. So like we mentioned,
this is a spoiler heavy. So let's go through the plot.
So more spoilers ahead. Dorian gets older, but he does not look it at all. Looks like me. He has the painting hidden away that that starts to show like wrinkles at the eyes and the forehead, but also, and I almost wonder if this is a Victorian idea, but everyone talks about how not only do you show your age, but you show your sins in your face. So like if you have done something horrible, like you can kind of read it on somebody's face and they almost become ugly because of it.
Right. And so it's sort of this continuing line throughout the book when Dorian is like trying to explain that he's done awful things in moments of like clarity, that people respond, you couldn't have done that, you're so beautiful.
Yes. Like, everyone says, no, only ugly people do terrible things. And I wonder how much this was an actual idea, like at the time, or just kind of like something Oscar Wilde was playing with or felt. Yeah,
it's very much equating ugliness to sin and beauty to purity, and sort of in a way that feels like he's presenting it as though it's obvious.
Yeah.
Like this isn't a really radical statement. It's like, if you're ugly inside, it will come out, essentially.
Yeah. And the transformation, why this happens, why the painting gets older and he does not, is not really that explained. It's just like the result of this prayer. But one really cool thing that I enjoyed is it almost like takes away some of his guilt magically, as it takes away like aging. It almost seems like instead of having this like hangover of grief, pretty privileged. Instead of having this like hangover of grief after he does something bad, it almost seems like it gets like washed away. I do think that was from the painting a little bit.
I think it's just him becoming like absolutely morally corrupt.
I think there was an implication. I read it as if there was an implication that the painting helped him.
In the implication, maybe in the
almost.
Sense that like by having the painting, Dorian feels like he is above normal men, and so that can contribute to it. But I don't think the painting itself is like wiping away guilt.
I thought
because
it did
he still experiences it.
Yeah, but I thought it was almost this thing that it was so much harder for him to experience. And I thought like, yes, it was like the corruption of him because he had his pretty privilege. Right. But also, I thought there was something when it first happened that came from before he knew the painting. His first like crime, so to speak, is before he knew that the painting changed to Sybil. And I thought there was some sort of like thing where he woke up the next day not having regretted it, and it was like partially because of that.
Yeah,
that's just my reading.
Well, something interesting to discuss is sort of like, so you have these three main characters: Dorian, Basil, the painter who created the portrait, and then his friend, Lord Henry.
Yeah.
Lord Henry is introduced to Dorian through Basil and is sort of the seed of all of his corruption. So Dorian is like this empty-headed, beautiful youth, meets Lord Henry. And a lot of scholars or readings of this take Lord Henry to actually be the devil. So Lord Henry is like whispering these temptations in Dorian's ear and never forcing his hand, but Dorian's so impressionable, so innocent, so young, and Lord Henry makes it seem like if he doesn't experience life to its fullness, he'll just absolutely die.
Yeah.
So it's truly a case of ultimate FOMO, I feel like, Dorian is experiencing. So through Lord Henry's like implications in his life, influence in his life, he becomes this horrible version of himself.
Yeah.
And like we said, that starts first off with Sybil Vane. So Dorian has this relationship with this woman, this young actress who's only 17. Do you remember that part where they're like, how old is she? 17. Lord Henry goes, I would have thought her younger than that. Her acting is terrible, and she's such an idiot.
Dorian, by the way, is like 18 in this, or 17 at the time.
Yeah, Dorian's
He's also a kid, yeah. But I think that's like adult enough to get married at the time.
Right. And I think Sybil Vane is sort of an interesting place to start with the novel's interaction with women, I feel like, because I was kind of curious how much of that was, it was interesting to try to piece together like who is Oscar Wilde in this book, and then what, like, in which ways is he being ironic, in which ways is he being like the actual narrator of the book, you know, like what opinions do you take from this that you think he's actually held? And when it came to women in the book, I was kind of like back and forth on that, because a lot of the like disparaging of women comes from Lord Henry, who is presented as this like devil, demonic person. So in some parts I was taking it as like, oh, Oscar Wilde's being tongue-in-cheek. But then if you look at Oscar Wilde's personal history, I was like, well, maybe he's not being tongue-in-cheek. I don't know. Did you have anything? Did you think about that at all?
I had a whole, I don't want to move the conversation in too much of a different direction yet, but I really thought Sybil Vane was interesting. I almost thought about it more as like, what is basically, as Evelyn mentioned, this was a novella that was quickly expanded, I think, to be a novel. I'm sorry that I don't know more of like the history of this book, but my understanding is that some sections were added pretty rapidly. And it felt like that. Like some sections felt like they really went on like unnecessarily and felt like they were a little rushed. And I thought the Sybil Vane like chapter, probably not because it's so important to the plot, but it just
I actually didn't feel that way about that.
It felt like I didn't like it at all. I thought like Sybil Vane and the family were written so poorly.
I think honestly a lot of this book is written poorly.
Yeah, it was
which
is
almost kind of a controversial opinion.
Yeah,
but like I think it was not near for a poet and like someone who was so renowned and so loved.
Well, I'm a big fan. I think his plays are so funny.
Yeah,
and they're obviously really different. But I'm reading this, like my generous take is that the novel has come a long way since he was writing.
Oh, like the novel as
the novel as a form.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I mean, that's actually something that I've thought about this whole summer, reading all these books. Before that, I'd read, the classics of Victorian literature, but I hadn't really like spent a ton of time just reading Victorian novels back to back to back. And I kept thinking like, we're really doing a lot better now.
Like, it's almost like if you watch a movie from like the 30s, like you really appreciate it, but the dialogue is like crazy. And even for that time, or like, it's just clear. Like I think Oscar Wilde was an amazing writer.
Well, something that's great about this and about the dialogue is like how clever it is. I feel like oftentimes, and he was known for these like epigrams, Oscar Wilde, these just like witty turns of phrase. And so you can pick out every line of dialogue from Lord Henry, especially you can pick out and be like, that could be the intro to a novel. Like all of these really like broad, sweeping, but also clever and interesting points of view. But to get back to the plot, so Sybil Vane, the actress, Dorian falls in love with her. She falls in love with him, but the second he has
a young actress he sees on stage in this like terrible theater, and he's like, she is beautiful
among
this terrible, ugly play.
Right, but then she has one night where she acts terribly, and it so repulses Dorian that she's like lost her craft, that he's like, I don't want to marry you anymore. You disgust me. I'm repulsed.
And she contests that, like, I don't even care about acting anymore because I've seen real love. This love on stage is fake. I don't care. I'm not even trying. And he's like, the only thing I loved about you was your art. Crazy.
Yeah, absolutely insane. So he leaves her and she commits suicide, much like all of her Shakespearean heroines that she plays. Yeah. So, and
she was
Dorian,
Juliet that night.
She was Juliet, yeah. So very, ideal situation. Yeah. So that's Dorian's first really big mark that the portrait takes, is sort of this, like, he was cruel, he spurned her, he caused this young woman's death. And from there, it's just like...
And that's when he discovered, he sees his beautiful portrait in his room and realizes there's something like different about the mouth and it looks crueler.
Right. So then we're like jumping forward through years, through summers. He's falling into like debauchery after affair, after drug addiction.
But he's still this beautiful like 18-year-old face.
Yes.
Yeah.
Culminating in what I thought was the best scene of the book, which is when he murders the artist of the painting.
Yeah,
Basil,
the painter of the...
who has always been his faithful friend. And I thought many times in this book, I was like, this is not well done. Just like the book itself, I was like, it's pretty disjointed and kind of like super flowery, which we could talk about too. But this scene, I was listening to this part on audiobook and I was like,
I was really surprised and enjoyed that.
Right.
I think I could see it coming a few lines ahead, but generally it was really exciting.
Right. So things really like steamroll from there, and then we end. So there's, Sybil's brother tries to kill him. He like ruins all of his friendships.
Yeah.
Everyone
and
around
Sybil Brothers
him
is killed. Like anyone who turns and tries to hurt Dorian is like killed.
Or they kill themselves.
Yeah. Like so the painter was trying to sway Dorian and was like, hey, you are being terrible, but you can change. And Dorian has this like fit of rage, which is why, again, I feel like there's this like devilish psychological influence of the painting. And I'm sure this has been written about and talked about and stuff that I just like don't know. But that was my like sample read, is like there is something more beyond just like the normal corruption of him getting this like advantage in life. I also think that the painting had almost like a devilish influence where like when someone tried to like stop him.
I really disagree.
I really felt that.
I think the devilish influence is completely from Lord Henry. And I think the painting is just this like otherworldly boon that puts Dorian above other men, and sort of to him then justifies what he's doing.
I think his actions towards Sybil and the painter felt like when it was described, like there was something else acting upon him.
So we end with him destroying the portrait. Dorian
trying to
stabs the portrait, and then their roles are reversed.
Yeah, it's like he goes to stab the portrait, and then he outside the house they hear yells.
Right, so the portrait becomes beautiful again, and Dorian is
stabbed.
The withered mass of himself on the floor, an old man, finally.
Yeah.
Oh
man of like 40.
And so we end. Yeah. So something interesting to talk about is, which I thought about bringing up all this like flowery language, is Oscar Wilde was sort of this like big proponent of the aesthetic movement in the Victorian era and the literary movement. So we're coming out of like, and which we've seen if you've been reading along with these books, like Anne Brontë, particularly, all these books are written to tell a moral tale, essentially. Like literature was sort of seen as the basis of morality, and from which morality should guide the common person or the reader. And at the time this was published, the late 19th century, we're sort of getting towards the point where people are pushing back on that, writers are pushing back on that. And Oscar Wilde has been quoted saying, you know, a book can't be morally right or morally wrong. It can only be well written or poorly written.
Yeah.
And that's sort of paved the way for critics to disparage his character, which we could talk a lot about. But also just publishing a book that's more of a dedicated to beauty as opposed to like a Pilgrim's Promise type tale. Like this is how you should act and how you should respond. But I find that kind of funny, and I'm interested to know what you think, because I found this book to be like exceptionally didactic. Like I thought it's absolutely moral.
I don't have the like knowledge of Victorian literature or anything to like give anything more than my own opinion. I can't really like put it in context with the literature. I felt that way too. I wonder if its morality was less clear or less like didactic than other popular novels at the time, so therefore it was still a change, if that makes sense. Like maybe even though to us it's didactic, like back then it was far less. Or maybe I don't know though. Like I'm sure people who watch this will be like point out examples that I just haven't read. I thought it was got pretty didactic. I don't know that it necessarily was in the beginning, because some of the characters feel so evil.
Yeah, but I think the presence of evil
makes it
moral.
Because the evil is almost like obvious.
Yes, because it's so obvious.
Yeah. Like
the fact that the portrait becomes this, you know, beauty and ugliness comes to the outside with sin. I was like, how can you get more moral than that?
Yeah.
You know? But yeah, it's funny. But I also think maybe that's colored by like what we read as sin now. Even more so was read in the Victorian era. So we read all these, like, I think it's worth talking about queerness in this book, and Oscar Wilde was gay and had male lovers.
Yeah.
And at the time, of course, that's a crime, and we can talk about his whole trial and persecution for this. But so maybe to the modern reader, we read that as sort of like, you know, that just sort of floats past the mind when they're being very homoerotic in their language.
When it's very clear that they're queer.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And
it's
so
like these guys are not.
For us,
it's not explicit.
We read murder and all these things as the sin. But I think to the Victorian reader, they're reading, oh, he's gay, so that's the sin. And that's not disparaged.
Yeah.
And so perhaps that's where it's coming from, of like moral ambiguity.
I also understand, I just learned this morning from Evelyn, that there was, like the version we read now was not as, it's more like censored than what he originally wrote.
So I'm actually really interested in finding the earlier version. So this book, as it is now, was published in 1891 as a full novel, and it was fleshed out. And that's what Francis was sort of talking about earlier with, there are parts that feel like filler, which I would completely agree. Like there's like 5 pages straight of descriptions of jewels
Which honestly, like, I found it in general interesting. It just
the
went
first
for
2 paragraphs, I was
so
like,
long.
cool.
And forms
then,
of death and the Renaissance and murder, which again was so cool, but it just dragged on and on and on.
Right.
It felt like
his publisher essentially asked him to beef this up so they could publish it as a novel because that would do better.
Which like happened all the time.
Happens all the
wanted
time.
more words. Yeah.
Right. And I don't think he did a great job filling it up. But
which I think a lot of people disagree with. I think a lot of people are like, I read one introduction to this book that was like,
any introduction is going to be
I know. But it's not like an introduction of somebody who knows the author. It's
no, but a lot
of
modern critics have called this like pretty stagnant, like in terms of actual like language and whatever.
Cool. I would agree.
But what was I going to say? Oh, so the original novella, which I am really interested in reading now, was published in a magazine, as much of literature was, and it was way gayer. It was like extremely homoerotic for the Victorian era. So for us now, we'd be like, oh, they winked at each other, but back then we're like, oh. Yeah. And that version was used 5 years later to prosecute Oscar Wilde in a sodomy trial for having a consensual male lover, which was illegal at the time. And so they got Oscar Wilde up on the stand and they literally read from his own novella these really...
As part of the evidence.
These really homoerotic passages. And we're like...
Even in this version, you read it knowing that like he was secretly like had a male lover, secretly at least like in some form in society. And you're like, this feels obvious.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Oscar Wilde was married to a woman, Constance, I think.
Yeah, Constance, who it seems like he like very much loved and like was into until which I read was her second pregnancy. Then he was like
they became completely estranged.
Yeah, he was just like not attracted to her anymore.
Because he fell in love with this man, Alfred, this young Lord Alfred. Yes, and so married to Constance, had 2 children, but in when was it, like 1895, was convicted and arrested for sodomy and sort of this like moral failing in Victoria.
Weren't there like 2 trials? Like I think he won the first trial and then he sued back for libel.
Yes.
I was like, how dare you say that I'm gay? But then he lost that and then was like found to be clearly.
Yeah, it was originally because he sued for libel. He sued the father of his lover for libel. And then through that trial, evidence was brought up against Oscar Wilde, and then he was prosecuted. So it was like this whole crazy legal affair. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, 2 years hard labor.
Yeah.
And from that point, he didn't live much longer after being released. He was like very sickly. His work took on an extremely different tone after this. So prior to this conviction, we have the Picture of Dorian Gray, we have the plays, which maybe you want to talk about a little bit, but they're very like decadent. That's sort of the aesthetic movement that he fit into, was this aestheticism, this decadent movement where it was like, let's celebrate beauty and love and passion and all of these things and explore life past morality. And then post prison sentence, he wrote about these very totally serious about prison life, about reform, about suffering, essentially, and died shortly after being released. And after he was convicted, he never saw his children again either. Mm-hmm. And so he died in Paris. He fled London, never came back, wrote a few more things, very sad things, and then died young at 46. Yeah, depressing.
It's horrible.
Depressing. Yeah. But do you want to talk about his plays, his drama?
Yes, I can only talk about what I've read. I haven't I don't know a ton about his theatrical life. I also know that he was mainly a critic before he wrote this novel. But I love the plays that I read of his. I read the famous The Importance of Being Earnest and An Ideal Husband. Really, really funny, especially The Importance of Being Earnest. And so referenced in literature. There's a fantastic Tom Stoppard play called Travesties that plays on it. But super funny. The main similarity, obvious one similarity that's very obvious, is just constant witticisms from all the characters. They're constantly saying things that sound like philosophical statements, whether they're jokey or not. An Ideal Husband is a little more a little more serious. There's just like this. It's more about like this guy who's done something bad in his youth, and it comes back to haunt him, and then he has to make this big moral choice. I would recommend those really strongly. I don't know that I would recommend Picture of Dorian Gray to most people, but like if one of those plays was playing at the Cape May stage, I'd be there at opening night. Really, really funny plays, even now. I think they very much hold up. Is there anything else that you want me to talk about specifically?
Well, no, I think it's funny to talk about him as a comedic writer, and that's something my mom brought up too. Is like knowing him as a comedic writer. It's interesting to look at this whole novella as ironic. So,
cool.
Can it be taken as sort of extremely tongue-in-cheek to the point that taking any part of it seriously is sort of like
misreading it,
or
that's
like out
of
the joke.
Yeah,
I do think parts of it are extremely ironic. Like I think the fact that Lord Henry is so absurdly a horrible character in every possible way is like intentional.
I thought he's like charming enough that like I found him funny at some points. Like,
he's hilarious. But it's like every possible time he lays an opinion about the world, it's like terrible, right? It's essentially like if other people are suffering, oh well, as long as you're, it's like, and it's kind of funny I think he does this really cleverly, touches on a huge range of social topics usually when they're at these like dinner parties or having these, very long, intelligent discussions that were plaguing England at the time. So, and touches through as many as possible. So it's like women's liberation, and we're talking about like race and class politics, and we're talking about all the role of art and the like what role the artist has in society, and how all these different things that come up like again and again interspersed throughout this overarching narrative of this like Gothic portrait. I think he uses Lord Henry, I think, as this like device to represent just moral failing, or sort of like maybe not even moral failing, but just a complete self-centeredness, a sort of like disinterest in others' suffering, or perhaps about like in the broadest sense bettering the world or doing anything that could like serve humanity in any nebulous way. It's just like life is short, get as much pleasure out of it as you can. If you stomp on other people in the way, such is life.
The importance of being earnest really roasts like very wealthy people. The characters in it are insane, and I think purposely so. They like really are made fools of.
Right.
And I wish I knew more about this, but I think his political leanings were more left. And so I think there's a lot of criticism in his work.
Yes.
Again, I can't take the professor here.
When this came out, he was like destroyed by critics. Like
really?
Painted as caricatures in Mad, because he was really famous. And so was sort of hated and loved. It was like no in between. And like Harper's Weekly published this issue about him where it was like this horribly ugly caricature of him as this like flowery dandy on the cover of it, just like annihilating him. Like, and so many publications did this constantly.
Wow.
And yet he was really like, the plays always did well. He was really enjoyed by the masses, as is typically like what we've been discussing of books this summer, is like the masses loved it and critics hated it, and that's sort of why we read it less and less.
Do you know if like, this might be too specific question, but do you know if like really upper class people enjoyed his plays? Or
I don't know broadly enough to say yes or no. Like the plays did well, and they were performed in London, so like by nature more wealthy people would go. But that being said, it might have been sort of a guilty pleasure type thing because he was accused by countless newspapers, Harper's Weekly was extremely prestigious, of these like upper echelon publications of just being like completely morally corrupt. So it was sort of dismissed as, this book particular dismissed as like vulgar trash, like all of these things that were just like the public shouldn't read this. He should be prosecuted for this. You know, it was a time when like moral law felt very important to the people and to the government, at least.
Yeah.
And so he was very much on the other side of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we talk about like our? I mean, we have a lot, but like our overall opinion of the book, whether we
Yeah.
recommend it, etc.
Yeah, you go first.
My take is like, there's a lot I don't understand about the book. I really am interested in the idea of reading this as like an ironic novel that's supposed to be taken. And sorry if I'm misunderstanding what you're all saying, but like that you're supposed to take as somewhat joking. I don't know that I would recommend it to most people. Again, I would recommend his plays to go see or even read. I really like reading them. I would recommend, so like I was here for Mrs. Sequel, I would recommend that to so many people. I would recommend this to less. Even if you take it ironically, I think that maybe, even for me, is like kind of a harder way to enjoy the novel without maybe the context of somebody who knows a lot more about literature this time.
Yeah, I think I would recommend it.
Good.
I find him just so interesting.
Yeah, he's a cool dude.
And I think, but obviously I'm someone who, like you say, like, reads a lot of literature. So if you're someone who's a big reader, I think it's like, oh, you can hear the train horn in the background. It's really interesting how it fits in with this time period, I think. And I think scenes of it, I'm interested in finding the original novella because I think a lot of the failing, maybe that's too strong a word, of this is what I would assume are these filler scenes to make the novella into a novel. We sort of lose the focus of the portrait, like the main story.
Also, like plot-wise, it does, not to be like too obsessed with that, a novel does not need to be like fully plot-heavy, but like it really feels like in the beginning of the chapter something happens, they talk for a long time, and then at the end of the chapter something happens, in a lot of them.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think a lot of the conversation is interesting, it just could be cut down. Like, I think this was intended by Wilde to be a much shorter piece, and I think if it was, it would be fantastic.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of like we get bogged down or are walking through all these different points of view and all these ideas and tangents and descriptions that aren't really necessary.
Yeah.
But the scenes that to me feel like the heart of the novel, like we see the portrait, the Sybil Vane part, the murder of Basil, and the end. Like if that was just it, I'd be like,
really. And again, I would recommend this to some people. I just wouldn't recommend it as widely.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking like most of my friends, what am I going to recommend? Probably not this one. Probably Mrs. Sequel first for me. But
yeah.
No,
but
I did enjoy it. I think especially if you're doing this whole summer of like Victorian novels, then I think like you should definitely include this. What a cool and important story to do. And like Oscar Wilde's one of those people where like the question of like, oh, if you could have dinner with anyone.
Did Wilde mock any specific famous people in this novel? Did he draw from any particular work written by someone? Yeah. So to answer your second question first, there was this novel published called, what was it called? Victoria something. And, oh, this is going to kill me. And he bases the whole character of Sybil Vane off of this woman from, the protagonist from a 1850s novel. And sort of pays homage to that in her name. They've like almost like the Carmilla Millarca. It's like that type of thing, like anagrams, but it's like rhyming instead of that. So that was really influential. Did he make fun of any specific famous people? I mean, there's a lot of reference to many things that are going on. I'm not sure if any of it was mocking. There's a ton of Shakespeare in this.
Yeah, so much mention of Shakespeare. It's also like Faust, the story of Faust. Like the basic premise of this does come, I'm guessing, elsewhere, which is like not at all a criticism at all. Like,
right, and it's sort of, he says that, doesn't he, in the foreword? It's like the story of like being tempted is Faust, right? It's like being tempted by some eternal beauty, and then what comes of that, and sort of taking that like allegorical classic story into what for him was modern day England.
Yeah.
Right. But I would say the biggest influence, at least that I picked up on this, was Shakespearean, I think, and he's sort of doing that tongue-in-cheek, but in a way that I think works.
Do you think it goes beyond the Sybil Vane parts?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's just.
I mean, they talk about it all the time.
Shakespeare like loves for people to commit suicide. It's like at the slightest problem, they're like, I have to end it all, and that happens here too. It's like there's 20 suicides in this book. It's crazy. Like, and then I think just the dramatic proportions of this and how there's sort of a guidance of fate, it feels like, was very Shakespearean.
Yeah.
This idea of like, you know, you trifled with fate or you questioned destiny, and now like you have to suffer for it, and that's how it's going to play out. No matter what you try to like outwit it or outstrap it, this is how it's going to happen. Felt like that to me.
Mm-hmm. I wonder how specific that is to Shakespeare versus just like English literature in general.
Oh, I mean,
but I totally agree.
So much English literature is based on. Yeah. And then Sybil, like he falls in love with all the great heroines of Shakespearean literature. You know, she's Rosalind, and then she's Juliet, and then she's like all these different people. The disguises. Yeah, I just felt like Shakespeare was a really big influence in this.
Definitely.
But that's worth looking into a little bit more.
And I also wondered, it says, did Wilde mock any specific famous people in this novel? I don't really have a real answer for this, but one thing that I was wondering is there were a couple times when there were like dukes and other characters mentioned, obviously fictionalized. There's like the Duchess of Monmouth was a character in it, and her husband was like mocked. There's a real Duke of Monmouth, obviously, at the time. Like,
right. Okay.
I'm sorry if I mixed up the titles, but
no, you're helping me remember. He said in a few interviews that a lot of these characters were based off of his friends who were like up in British society. Yeah. So not necessarily famous in perhaps the sense we would think of, but extremely well known.
I wonder if some specific lords and dukes would read this and be like, dude, what are you doing?
Yeah.
This is me.
Yes. So even to the point where people suggested like, oh, Lord Henry is so-and-so. And that's obviously a damning similarity. So he responded to that one. Oscar Wilde responded to that one and was like, no, it's fiction. But he's claimed like, yeah, these are based off of like things that have happened or my friends.
Yeah.
So definitely based off of upper British society for sure. Yeah, it's a fascinating book, and I think Oscar Wilde as a person is so fascinating, which is why I enjoyed this.
Yeah, it's kind of getting to earlier. Like, I would love to just sit down with him. If you know, of like people, of like writers in history, you could sit down with. I think Oscar Wilde would be one of the most interesting.
Even reading about his trial was so fascinating because he was like apparently recalled as being so witty on the stand. Like they would accuse him of all these things and he would answer in these really like clever and funny turns of phrase.
But it's a celebrity trial in the way that I thought.
Totally a celebrity trial. Yeah. Which didn't turn out well for him. But yeah. Yes. Great. If there's any final questions, feel free to toss them in. Hopefully we answered some. Maybe give an interesting discussion about this. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this one, and for those of you who have been with us for most of the summer. Joan, I know you're always here. Aiden and Juan, thank you for tuning in. And my mom, I know you're in there somewhere, so thanks for watching.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks for having me, Evelyn. Thanks for letting me
thanks for coming back
read this book that I wanted to read. And I'm definitely in no position to really give anything more than opinion about this, but it was great to talk about it.
Yeah.
It was a book that I read that I really wanted to talk about, so I'm happy there's a book club dedicated to it. I'm sure there's so many book clubs out.
Yeah, it's been so fun just talking about like learning for myself more about Victorian-era literature. Like, Lindsay says, happy birthday, Francis.
Oh, thank you, Lindsay.
It's Francis' birthday tomorrow, so big celebrity moment here at the book club. Yeah. Victorian literature is like so fascinating. It's so weird. It's so of its own time. It's very gothic. I think it's worth picking up some lesser-known ones. So hopefully you've done that this summer. Mm-hmm. Oh, happy birthday. A lot of birthday wishes. Thank you, Joan. Thanks for watching. Thanks everybody for being here. This is so nice. Well, maybe we'll do it again next summer. Mm-hmm. New theme. I'm thinking about like lighthouses.
Great. Love that.
I'm like Virginia Woolf. That's all I got. But I'll look into it more. So maybe we'll see you next summer. Maybe we'll do a little winter series, some good like classic Christmas tales.
Love that.
We'll see what we can bring up. But thank you guys so much. It has been so wonderful doing this summer. I really enjoyed it. You guys have been so wonderful, a great group. And thanks again to Francis, our wonderful guest, and to everyone else who's been my guest this summer. Big thank yous. It's been super fun getting to know everybody and talking about these really great books. Winter series. All right, we'll see.
Thanks, everybody.
You can email me some suggestions and I'll think about it.
Bye.
All right, bye everyone. Thank you so much. Bye.